Hello and welcome back to the Healthy Highlife Podcast. If you're new here, thank you so much for joining me. My name is Malcolm, a strength and mobility coach, passionate about health, fitness, wellness, and cannabis. If you're joining me again through other episodes, I appreciate you. Thank you so much. And I would appreciate it if you could all hit the subscribe and like button in order to help grow the community. My goal with this podcast is to help those who may be struggling or falling into some of these negative, detrimental patterns or habits and stereotypes that surround cannabis, and to bridge the gap to those who have managed to create a healthy and sustainable relationship around the plant, whilst maintaining an ambitious and driven perspective on life. Because as many of you may agree, weed tends to get the blame a lot of the time. Oh, he's lazy because he smokes weed. Oh, she doesn't do this because she smokes weed, so on and so forth. But really, the reality is, just like many other things, is it's not the weed that's to blame. Sure, cannabis can help amplify or enhance what's already in you, or the tendencies and outlooks and perspectives that you already have, or the frames of life that you already have. But it's not the catalyst or the trigger that was actually the root of the problem. It just amplified the problem. And so when the true internal work gets done and you become honest and you take responsibility and ownership over your use of the plant, well, then positive things start to happen, because you no longer fall into mindless use of the plant, but actually you create purpose and intention with the plant. Now, if you join me in the first episode, we dove into that a little bit there. So if you haven't seen it, go back and watch it and let me know what you think. Before we get into today's topics about using cannabis intentionally to help enhance movement, body awareness, and avoiding the reliance along with poor habits, I'd love to hear what flower you guys have chosen for this evening. I've gone for a mix of Space Runts by Pressure Packs and Harlequin CBD flower from Watchana. Now, the reason I've gone for this 50-50 split is to offset the high amounts of THC that come in all these recreational packs these days. Because as much as THC can be fun, abusing it, just like abusing anything, is going to lead you down the path of negative results. So therefore, I've chosen to split it between CBD flower and THC flower so that I can get the best of both worlds and get that entourage effect that comes with the full spectrum. Because if you're just hammering that THC, you're not getting all the good stuff that comes through the CBD and all the other cannabinoids, and vice versa. So finding a balance between the two and then finding a way in which you can then use that going forward is one of the keys. All right, let's spark this up and let's get into it. All right, so now we've got that burning. Hope you guys have too. Let's get into it. Mobility versus flexibility. Are they the same thing? No. Flexibility gives you access to passive ranges of motion where you don't really own it, whereas mobility gives you access and control to those ranges of motion. Now, the question here tonight is, can cannabis help improve both, or will it just make you feel looser? First of all, let's just dive into the differences between flexibility and mobility. Flexibility, also known as passive range of motion, ROM, is the ability to lengthen muscles, getting to deep, long stretches, relaxing muscles in these long stretches over time. Think sitting in a pigeon stretch or a hamstring stretch. Just hold that for a long time and look for the body to allow you to get into those positions. Passive range of motion is extremely useful and can be used in conjunction with helping to down-regulate things like your nervous system. Using your passive stretching at the end of your day before bed will help you kind of flip the switch from a really active fight or flight response down into a down-regulated position where you can actually get into that rest and recovery. But I will stress that the whole passive stretching thing is not the key, and it's not going to make you feel less tight. On the other hand, we have mobility, and this is active control of range of motion. So this is your ability to move a joint through its full range of strength and stability. For example, taking yourself down into a controlled deep squat where you're in full range of motion using your brain's control to get you there. Whereas the other option of that could be putting weight heavy enough on you to whereby it's actually just pushing you down, in which case you're working passively in ranges of motion that you don't technically own. And therefore, mobility requires the nervous system to engage into those ranges of motion, those extreme end ranges of motion, not just to loosen muscles there and then let it feel relaxed. Because even though sometimes you might do a stretch and it makes you feel good and it makes makes you feel relaxed, it's not actually doing what you think it's doing. And then ultimately, it's going to result in the body tightening up even more in the future, because what your brain can't control, it can't comprehend. And so if you're not training into these ranges of motion and getting into the details of what your body and your joint structure can actually do from a brain connectivity standpoint, then you're not actually owning the ranges of motion in which you think you have, that you see when you hold a passive end range stretch. Now, there are ways of bridging that gap, and that's a whole training modality in itself, which is kind of the stuff that I do on a daily basis. But this podcast is about how can we make cannabis fit into it so that it helps these processes to get us the results that we're looking for. But when it comes to it, a bit like in last week's episode, where I spoke about using it as a pre-workout to enhance your mind-muscle connection, your internal control, and so on, THC can also help reduce muscle tension, as well as enhancing that proprioception in the body. If your proprioception is greater and your body awareness is higher, with lower muscle tension, you're going to be able to internally connect to that environment that you normally would be unaware of through your day-to-day. But if you set the intention and you use the plant correctly, you can actually access these details in your movement and enhance that session. So for those of us who are looking to get true detailed work into those end ranges where we're connecting internally, using the plant, usually a nice 50-50 between THC and CBD, will give you that effect, will allow you to take deeper dives into some of these ranges of motion that you normally wouldn't have access to. And the reason I say using CBD and THC pre-workout or pre-movement, whatever it may be, is because the CBD is going to help with inflammation and overall joint comfort. So if you're pushing into it and you're trying to work end ranges of novel tissue and ranges of motion and so on and so forth, you're going to want to be able to get there with some form of comfort. However, if you overuse it and you dampen those perceptions, well, you may be opening the door to potential injury because you're actually overstretching tissues or over lengthening tissues in ways in which you probably shouldn't. Well, as most of you will know, we have an endocannabinoid system in the body which modulates our pain, our coordination, and proprioception. And when we take in doses of THC, that is going to affect our sensory perception, which can then help us tune in to these end ranges and these little details, whilst other factors like coordination, pain, and proprioception are being taken care of and heightened to a degree. So we are aware of all these different aspects happening while we're trying to improve things like mobility or flexibility. We overuse anything or we abuse anything, it's going to end up in a point of diminishing return. So if you get too stoned before your workout, the chances are, depending on the person, obviously, because everything depends on the individual, the chances are for most people, they're going to get to a point of disassociation if they're overusing it. And this comes through the THC. This is that high side of things. And if you get too high, if you're someone who's really into it, depends on the individual. So if you're really into your training and you've got structure and you're disciplined and you're really into it, then getting too stoned is probably not going to get in the way of it, and you're going to be able to work through it until the point of that too stoned effect dampens down a bit, and then you just get back into it. However, if you haven't done that inner self work to get to the point where things like discipline or resilience or just doing the stuff you don't want to do, even when you don't want to do it, is part of your life, well, then you're probably going to be stronger from a mindset perspective to be able to work through some of those sedative effects or some of those disassociated effects if you overdo it before a workout. That being said, choosing your strains carefully, so things that contain pinene, limonene, or beta-carotene would be really good because they enhance focus, breath control. Limonene, known for its uplifting effects, and can also potentially remove any of that pre-movement anxiety. So that's pretty useful, especially if you're used to going into the gym and you get quite intimidated in the gym. You're not really sure what to do and you get that whole anxiety or anxiousness as you walk in. This could be a good option for you to help counter some of that. But to the point of this podcast and what this is all about, promoting and educating us into mindful use around cannabis when it comes to our life and our health and wellness. As I've already mentioned, using a lower dose THC strain or combining that with CBD or a nice hybrid before the mobility work can really enhance that awareness without overdoing it and avoiding that heavy sedation or anything else that may be loss of muscle control, for example, which could lead to that injury injury risk in the future. And these are things that you want to avoid, because ultimately we want to use this as a positive tool and not get to the point where it becomes a negative. But this could be done with anything. If you overtrain, it's negative for the body. It's too much stress for the body to handle and adapt to, in which case you get all the effects of overtraining. It's all about striking the right balance, figuring out what works for you and your setup, and then also taking accountability and ownership over you yourself, so that you and the way that your consciousness looks down at the way you live your life is directed in such a way to whereby cannabis doesn't become a negative. So how can we actually use it to improve our mobility training? THC and CBD will affect the way we approach mobility training. I've already mentioned how THC can help reduce muscle tension as well as enhance proprioception. Well, within that, it can help reduce that muscle guarding, which is the muscle tension. So oftentimes, if we have these points of weakness across the body, or we've got an injury, whether it's a high level or low level injury, or we've got points of tightness across the body, quite a lot of that can be put down to muscle guarding. And that's where our central nervous system is firing up a muscle to help protect another area that is under load or stress, or the system doesn't feel stable or strong enough to help use that area, in which case it's guarding it with the soft tissue. THC will also help us get into that deeper proprioception, which means when you are exploring and learning and familiarizing yourself with your internal environment, you're going to be able to take it deeper, further, with a lot more detail, compared to just, oh, well, yeah, so-and-so said I must do some hip mobility. Let me just flop around on the mat for a bit and then get on with my training. That's not going to lead you to any positive results. And in fact, that's just going to lead us down the road of frustration, because we're going to think we're doing things. We're going to kid ourselves into thinking we're doing things. But in actual fact, we're just creating a lot of noise and junk volume. The CBD will also offset some of the anxiousness or anything that may come from the THC. So if you're walking into the gym, and like I mentioned, you have that anxiety walking into a gym, the CBD side will start to dampen down some of those effects as well, to help support your mindset and your headspace as you're trying to then work into these details of your mobility or your training or whatever the goal is at hand. And much like I covered in the previous episode, using things like CBD and THC are going to help enhance that recovery. And ultimately, the recovery is where all the magic is going to happen, because you're going to go in, you're going to provide the stimulus, whether it's mobility stimulus or strength work stimulus, whatever it may be. Although technically mobility is strength work, it's just strength work for the joint specifically. And traditionally, we just think strength work surrounds the muscular system. So once you've sent the stimulus, you're then going to leave the gym and you're going to have to go and facilitate that recovery. So you're going to have to go and eat your protein. You're going to have to eat enough calories. You're going to have to sleep properly, stay hydrated, probably look into taking some creatine, which is where things like CBD come in, because that can help support recovery, reduce inflammation, and get that healing process acting faster. Personally, I found pairing cannabis with very controlled, intentional mobility movements, such as controlled articular rotations, more intense strength drills like pale rails and so on, the best use of the plant when it comes to this thing. Because if you hit that just a few times and then you go in and you start to do it, it lasts long enough for you to really get into some of the nitty-gritty details. And ultimately, you'll learn, if you pursue mobility training, that it's in the details where all the progress lies. And so creating a setting to help open the door to a much more specific and intentional environment internally will only yield a better result on the back end of it. So as I mentioned earlier, terpenes like pinene can actually help with breath control. And a big part of your mobility training, as with other training as well, is using your breath work to help enhance positions, direct intention, and create stimulus into various parts of the body, as well as creating something called irradiation, which is essentially contracting every muscle in your body to a certain level, depending on the intensity you want to apply to the specific joint. So that just about covers a brief overview of mobility training and how we can use cannabis to help enhance our experience and our results within it. Let's go into flexibility and passive stretching. What are the pros? What are the cons? And how can cannabis be used here in order to help facilitate a better outcome? THC is responsible for loosening and reducing muscle guarding. So if we're going to use it with the intention of passively stretching our body and increasing passive range of motion, aka flexibility, well, we can actually then use THC to help get deeper into these positions. And then once we're there, we're pairing the intention with the thought to then spend time and explore and feel those positions so that the central nervous system can start to access and let go here. A bit like in yoga, you pair these positional holds along with some internal mindful work, and that's going to yield you an outcome that oversteps many other modalities. However, as with anything, if we create an over-reliance on this, we may overstretch without that natural limiter, therefore getting to a point where we get improper muscular engagements. And if we get improper muscular engagements, that's going to affect our recruitment patterns. And when we go to lift weights or we go to do anything, our body's going to be confused as to how it's supposed to react and how it's supposed to recruit those muscles. And it's all going to get a little bit messed up, in which case you're then going to have to go down the whole road of reverse engineering what's happened. How did you get here? How did your body manage to adapt into such positions? And how are we going to reverse back out of it? Aside from just using the passive work, we can get into those passive holds and use contract relax techniques known as P&F stretching or PAILS, passive angular isometric loading. That's just about creating a connection, a contraction into these passive ranges of motion so that your brain actually has to activate and wake up and use these new ranges rather than just sit there in a dormant passive state. And that's where we start to bridge the gap between active and passive modalities, because it's all well and good holding those stretches and everything and having this flexibility. But what happens when you fall into that position or your body is needing to call upon that position, but you literally have no conscious control of that range of motion? That is why combining both passive and active modalities of stretching and mobility drills is going to give you the best overall result. And to the point of this episode, pairing all of that along with an intention and the right strain is going to help get you to the point where you maintain mental clarity. You can get into controlled relaxation without overstretching, without overdoing it. You're going to be able to maintain alertness whilst also supporting your recovery. It's going to get you into certain positions or certain thoughts and areas within your internal environment that you would never have thought to explore from a general perspective. And so when it comes to using cannabis as part of our lifestyle, is it just about getting high as fuck and enjoying it? Sometimes, but that's with anything. When it comes to using cannabis in our life as part of a daily responsible routine, we can actually amplify the effect of our mobility and our flexibility work, but only if we set the right purpose along with the use of the plant. If we overdo it, or if we end up smoking the wrong strain, we end up getting all these amazing ideas, we get a plan together, and then all of a sudden procrastination hits and boom, we're ending up doing nothing, or we're couch locked at 12 in the afternoon or some bullshit like that. Of course, you're going to start to get looked down on when you're falling into these types of habits. It's time to find that pattern interrupt, take control, take accountability, and use this stuff for what it can actually do to help us rather than hinder us. And the more of us who start to take responsibility over how we use it, the better the image around the plant are going to be. Because up until this point, it's been highlighted as, yeah, hi, man. And don't get me wrong, I love a good recreational session. I love it. I love to smoke a fat joint, but there's a time and place. And the time and place is not every single day. And it's not mindlessly throughout your days to whereby you get absolutely fuck all done. It's about striking a balance, just like in your nutrition, 80-20 split. You may have heard that rule with nutrition. 80% of your intake should be coming from single ingredient whole foods that don't fall into any of those processed categories. The other 20% or so can be some of those bits and pieces to give you some of that balance. But ultimately, the dominant factors going into your system are going to be the determining factor of the effects that come out. If you feed yourself crap food over and over again, you don't hydrate your body, you don't consider the importance of your sleep, you don't move your body, all these things are going to create an environment and a state within yourself that is not going to be conducive for productivity, ambition, drive, getting shit done. It's literally going to reinforce your need to just roll another one and watch another episode or play another round on the Xbox or whatever, right? It's about taking ownership over yourself and then applying cannabis as a tool on top of that to get the best outcome. So tonight we covered the differences between flexibility and mobility training, flexibility being passive, mobility being active, and we went into how cannabis can support both of those and where we can use it with the right intention to get the most out of both of those modalities. THC and CBD both impact movement differently, and we can use them together in order to get the best effect from both worlds, both the body enhancing and intrinsic control and awareness. And we went into a few of the terpenes that really matter when it comes to selecting your strains of choice in order to make sure you're choosing strains that support focus, creativity, and depending on whether it's pre-workout or post-workout, those that facilitate recovery. If you're still with me, thank you so much. And I would love it if you could pop in the comments below any experiences, or if you have any different approaches or any tips or tools and advice that we can share with the rest of us to help us all grow and elevate together so that we can smoke loud, but we can be proud of it instead of being looked down on. Thank you so much for joining me on the 4th episode of the Healthy High Life podcast. Next time, we'll be talking about cannabis and mindset. I touched on the state earlier, very briefly. We'll be diving into how influencing your state will ultimately determine your motivation, your consistency, and how you're going to take action and strategize for the future. I appreciate your time. Enjoy the rest of your joint. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time. Take care.